To Escape a Character, a novella. Something had been following me home that night. I'm not sure why or what exactly it was. All I knew for certain was that if I let it catch me, nothing good would come of it. My first suspicion that I was being followed began on what should have been a normal day. I was out and about into town, running some errands for my wife Emily. We were planning on inviting some acquaintances she had met during a meeting over for dinner, and she insisted that I go out for ingredients so she could procure something to meet their exceptional needs, whatever that meant. In any case, these guests clearly were important to my wife, so, not wishing to disappoint her, or worse, make her angry, I first set off for the market. I thought I'd stop by and get what we needed for our fancy meal, and then perhaps purchase some decorations for the table. A little eye candy wouldn't hurt, I figured. The marketplace was fairly busy, it being a Friday and all. Most people were gathering things for weekend grill-outs or dinners like Emily. Thankfully, it wasn't too crowded, so I was able to get what I needed pretty quickly without having to wait in lines for over 5 minutes at a time. Emily was the breadwinner of the home. I wouldn't have minded getting a job myself if not for the medical disability my doctor diagnosed me with 3 years before. I couldn't help but feel like he was trying to give me an excuse for being lazy, and maybe I took advantage of that. But I argued with myself that not every job involves working around flashing lights and dangerous machinery, and ironically, that was the kind of job Emily had. She had always been in the robotics division for as long as I've known her, which was about 8 years if I'm recalling correctly. She may have been interested in robotics farther back, perhaps since her childhood days. In such a position, the money was very good, but we never spoiled ourselves quite enough to be considered rich. At least not to someone who wasn't politically correct. And we never had any children to spend said money on anyway, so a great portion of it was always set aside for bills, needs, and emergencies only. After getting the food and decor, I made my way out of the market and towards home. We had no car, but we often took the bus to make travel more simple, so I made my way to the nearest bus stop and got comfortable on a bench. I waited for a good 10 minutes, I'd say, looking around and taking in sights. We didn't live in a great town, so to speak. It was pretty small, with only about 300 denizens inhabiting its otherwise empty forests and meadows. But it was still a very beautiful town, with its trees budding little pink flowers in the spring, and how nature always seemed to blend with the industrial look the town seemed to adopt. Essentially, it was like looking at an aesthetic forest meets factory picture. At the moment, I was watching 2 sparrows in the road bickering over an insect that had somehow gotten trapped in a glass cola bottle. The birds were rolling it around and pecking at each other, neither one backing down and both claiming ownership over the bug, even though the ground was practically crawling with them that day. I chuckled a little at their antics, and set my gaze upon the sky. The sun was peeking out through some white cirrus clouds, but farther off in the distance the clouds gradually became darker and menacing. If the bus didn't come soon, I'd have to jog home and hope I'd be able to beat the rain inside. Emily wouldn't have liked it if the groceries got soaked. That's when I heard a noise to my right. Not anything alarming, just the sound of some trash cans thumping together. I looked down the alleyway to see a shadow retreating across the brick wall of one of the buildings. I couldn't exactly brush it off to being a dog or cat rummaging through some garbage, simply because the shadow, from what I've glimpsed of it, seemed too big. I wondered if there were hooligan children running about, since gangs were relatively unheard of in our area. Still, I felt a significant amount of relief when the bus pulled to the curb. I paid my fare and sat down. I tried to sneak a peek down the alley as we passed, but it looked empty. I thought nothing more about it until I got to my stop. The bus didn't go all the way to our house. It couldn't. We lived in a rural area just outside the town's limits, so instead I had to be dropped off between a nearby gas station and convenience store. From there I walked the rest of the way home, a good 2 or 3 miles I'd estimate. For the most part, I enjoyed the walk home. Even though the coming storm still loomed overhead, I took in the sights and sounds of the woods. White-tailed deer grazed in the distant meadows, raising their heads up at me out of curiosity rather than fright. An occasional cardinal or robin flew across the path. Dogs barked from the nearby houses, and some played with one another out in the back roads. The scent of cut grass and moisture in the air refreshed my lungs. I picked up the pace a little, pleased to hear the cricket population start up a song. From somewhere in the woods behind me I heard a few leaves crunch. I turned to look, but there was no movement beyond the trees. Surely an animal of some kind had darted through the forest. Nothing too dangerous lived here, unless you wanted to count the snakes, scorpions, feral pigs, and on bad days a bobcat or two. But again, the noise sounded pretty big. Eventually I summed it up to being a deer and continued onward. The low sound of thunder rumbled ominously in the sky, and the wind picked up a tad. It wasn't too far from my house now, so I hurried along, only vaguely aware of the twigs crackling through the forest around me. Before long, I had made it up a hill and into a small cul-de-sac, containing only 2 other houses besides my own. I had just crossed the front lawn when I heard something from the woods across the road, something like a growl. At the time, I told myself it was just thunder, and that if I didn't make it back inside, the food would be ruined. So ignoring the chills I felt going through my spine, I made my way into the house. Emily was busy cutting up onions in the kitchen. She greeted me with a kiss and said, "Just put those right on the counter. I'll get to them in a bit. And for goodness sake, Nick, go find something semi-formal to wear." I laughed. "You make it sound like you're inviting your boss to dinner or something." Emily put her hands on her hips and gave me a disapproving smile. She always seemed to do that, I think. "They are important people, Nick. But it's only for one night, and I wanted to make a good impression because it may help me climb my career's totem pole." "Well," I replied, taking off my jacket. "Can't say I don't blame you, but can I at least have a smoke before I dress up?" Emily said, "You may, but don't forget to wash your mouth out afterwards. And make it quick. The heavens are going to flood down on us." I stepped out on the back porch, popping a cigar in my mouth before igniting it with my handy-dandy lighter. I smoked some, noticing the wind had really picked up now. The animal noises I heard not too long ago had all vanished. Not even the livestock had stuck around after my retreat indoors. Must be because of the storm, I thought. After blowing a few smoke rings, a loud clap of thunder told me my break was over. I went to our room and put on a fairly fancy suit for dinner. By the time I got dressed and made my way to the dining room, food was waiting on the table. Of course, Emily told me not to touch it until our guest arrived. She spent the next 10 minutes fussing over her dress, and then my suit, and then my hair. Eventually, a knock came at the door. We made our way over to open it. There, standing in the alcove of our porch, was a young man and woman. Both looked like they were in their mid-20s, and they had a generic look about them, like you couldn't really pick them out of a crowd if you tried. Both had brown hair, dark hazel eyes, and matching work uniforms, white button-down shirts with black pants and cheap flats. They wore no jewelry and were clean-cut. In short, they looked professional. Emily greeted them and told them to make themselves at home while she added a few finishing touches on dinner. She whispered to me that I ought to make some light conversation with them while she did so. I politely asked what positions they held in the company, but they either flat-out ignored my question or didn't seem to hear me, because the next thing I knew, they were commenting on the weather that blasted the house outside. In truth, they didn't seem like the suspicious type to me. They clearly didn't like me, but they didn't seem to hate me either. I wasn't too surprised. After all, I wasn't someone they saw on a regular basis, like my wife. For now, we just seemed on mutual terms with each other, and during the time I hadn't learned to pick up on red flags yet. And I certainly didn't see a connection between them and the thing I caught out of the corner of my eye in the alley. The rain was coming down in torrents at about 11 o'clock. The world was pitch black outside, lit up every now and then by a big flash of lightning that made the night seem like day. The thunder was almost deafeningly loud, rattling the windows of each explosive boom. The wind howled and blew in all directions, its sound distinct of a crying ghost. By this time we were all eating dinner together. Emily did most of the talking, both because I didn't quite know what to say and because the two guests were mainly interested in her and her projects. I wasn't paying a lot of attention to their conversation, but as I was poking at the beef stew with my fork, I picked up on a few words like experiment and revolution and potential. But before things had gone south that night, I couldn't tell if they were talking about my wife's work or something else. For the life of me, I'd give anything to have listened into the full contents of their discussion. Perhaps if I had picked up some sort of hint or sign, I could have prevented some, if not all, of the events that went down that night. After we had eaten and as dessert was being served, Emily suggested that she and her new friends, whom I discovered were named Ashley and Dave, ought to work on future projects together. They agreed, but said that from now on all business extractions between them and the company had to be, in their own words, strictly confidential. Emily seemed confused about the reply, but understood that they at least included her in something. And so, bellies full of ice cream, and it being after midnight, Emily showed our guests where their sleeping quarters were and decided to retire herself. She told me it'd be a real shame to allow them to drive back home in this horrid weather, and that the least we could do was show some hospitality. I showed them enough hospitality tonight by wearing the sitchy suit, I complained. Emily laughed and gave my shoulder a playful slap. "Stop being so dramatic," she giggled. "Like I said, it's only for tonight. And what's better, they're collaborating with me in their projects." I sighed. "I get it, it's just, I don't know." Truly, I didn't know. What could I have said? That I didn't trust them? That even if they were the nice people Emily was convinced they were, I still had a problem with complete strangers sleeping in her house? I decided to have one last smoke out in the dining room to calm myself before going to sleep. As I walked past the guest bedroom, I couldn't help but overhear a whispered conversation going on behind the door. Although it has never been in my nature to eavesdrop, I found myself creeping closer to listen. "How are we supposed to do that?" Ashley was saying. "That man is acting weird around us. Not to mention we have Evan on our tails." "Forget Evan," Dave roughly interrupted. "What's important right now is that we need to stick to the plan. One of us have to let you know who in before the rain gets to him, while the other one acquires a signal out in this weather." Ashley muttered, "Let me guess. That last part would be up to you." Dave replied, "You know damn well I'm better at the hacking business than you are." "So, how are you going to get a signal in this wasteland?" Ashley asked. "This ought to be good." There was some silence before Dave answered, "You'll see. When the proper time comes, I'll let you know." I decided to sneak away before they detected my presence. I sat in the dining room, smoking and looking out at the backyard. I kept the lights off so I could think. Besides, the dark felt safe to me. I had no clue what Dave and Ashley were up to, but I was fully prepared to defend my home if they tried anything of the violent sort. I thought for a moment about waking Emily and telling her what I heard, but ultimately concluded it wouldn't matter. Emily was the stubborn kind. People who set their minds on an idea and never expand on it. She'd call me rude for spying on them and tell me to go to bed. No, I'd stay up all night until I could figure out what was going on. My gut instinct was telling me something was wrong, and I trusted it at all times. So trying not to watch the strobe show in the sky, I walked out on the back porch. It was so dark I couldn't even see the rain. I took out my lighter and cupped one hand over it, looking around for a weapon I could use, just in case. I found a spade lying near the stairs, but that was all I could find for the moment. I picked it up and was momentarily startled when I heard a soft meow from below. I looked down the staircase to see a cat wagging its tail, obviously pissed about being in the rain and probably begging to be let inside. "Sorry," I told the cat. "We don't allow pets in here." Before I could finish my sentence, the cat was whisked out of sight and disappeared into the darkness, yowling wildly. Without thinking and almost tripping over my own 2 feet as a result, I ran back inside and slammed the door, locking it. I turned off my lighter instantly, hyperventilating and letting my eyes adjust to the dark once more. I could see just a little out of the back door, but no more than a foot or so. The lightning flashed and I counted under my breath. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7... Thunder boomed. The storm wouldn't be going away for a while. What was I doing? I just saw something out there, and instead of doing anything sane, I was calculating the storm's distance. The lightning flashed again, but I wasn't counting it anymore. I calmed myself down enough to contemplate my next move. I asked myself a few questions I couldn't seem to find the answer to. Was that Dave outside? And if it was, why didn't I see him earlier? It meant he'd have to have snuck out through the front door and make his way to the back. But then, if it was a signal he was looking for, why go through all the trouble of drenching himself in the rain? Surely he wasn't so desperate for a signal he'd leave incriminating evidence of him having left the house because of his soaked clothes. So Dave was still in the house. But what was that I saw outside? The lightning strobed once more, and I did all I could not to scream when I saw the cat's head hurtling toward the back door, colliding with it in a bloody mess, spinal cord and all. I stumbled backwards, tripped over a chair and fell. I scrambled to my feet and ducked behind a counter, poking my head around the corner. I couldn't take my eyes off the splattered gore careening down the glass. The back door was struck by something heavy over and over again. Whatever killed the cat was trying to break in. I had seen enough. But as much as I wanted to curl up in a ball and hide, I couldn't let whatever this malevolent thing was come in and hurt Emily. Feeling adrenaline course through my veins, I held the spade over my head and crept over to the door, hugging the wall as I went. The striking sound paused momentarily, only to be replaced by a loud scraping noise as something sharp like a rake dragged across the glass. I flung the door open and struck the being with the spade. Pain shot up my arm as I did so, hearing a loud metallic clank. Stunned, I tried to close the door, but the creature was blocking it. I continued attacking whatever was preventing the door from shutting until it retreated back outside. I waited for a few moments after securing my porch, trying to catch my breath. Loud footsteps went further away from where I stood, eventually becoming lost in the rain. The monster did not return. Ignoring my throbbing arm, I made my way to our bedroom. My wife might not believe what I had to say about our guest, but surely she'd understand what peril we were in after she had a good long look at my red arm. When I did tell Emily about everything I saw and heard, she very nearly pushed it all off as figments of the imagination until I got to the part about the creature. Emily jumped out of bed, her tired face suddenly an expression of terror. "Oh my God," she murmured. Without a word, she grabbed her jacket. "Hey, what's going on?" I asked, confused. She was fretting bad, and I noticed she packed a taser in her purse. "I never thought the damn thing would get out," she said mostly to herself as she grabbed my hand. "Can you please tell me what the hell is going on?" I insisted. Emily gave me such a serious look that I stopped asking. "We need to go to the shed first," she whispered. "Find a way to defend us from him." We braved the downpour awaiting us outdoors and silently slipped into our shed. I really didn't feel any safer with a little laser in tow, but Emily brought along a UV light. We sat there together for a moment before my wife spoke. Me, Dave, and Ashley were working on a top-secret group project together. The original reason for its secrecy was because it was supposed to be a surprise for Evan, our superior, but later on it became a secret for other reasons, moral reasons. She paused for a moment to see if I would respond. I didn't, so she continued. The experiment's name was WH-129-34, but we just call him Whisper. Whisper looks like one of those animatronics you'd see as a kitty at a kiddie pizza place. Unlike a typical animatronic, however, he is unusually bloodthirsty. We had this protocol should he escape, but I thought he might have found a way around that anyway. I wasn't certain. But since it seems to have followed you home, we need to escape. I stared at her, unbelieving. Escape? With all due respect, Emily, I still don't understand what this Whisper's purpose is other than kill everything that moves. Secondly, how are we going to run through the pitch-black woods in the middle of a storm with that thing stalking around out there? We'll die before we even make it out of the neighborhood. Emily seemed distraught, a helpless look in her eyes. At that moment I wrapped my arms around her and said, "If there is a way out, we'll look for one, but right now we need to fight back." There appeared to be no other choice. She took my injured arm and gently caressed it. "I'm surprised he didn't already kill you," she said. "Whisper is very strong and very fast. He must have been sizing you up." We cuddled a little before grabbing whatever qualified as a weapon in the shed, from a pickaxe Emily had to a sledgehammer I hauled along. It didn't seem like enough, but in reality it was all we had. As we made our way back into the house, we held hands and drew close together, unsure of what would come next. But Whisper was the least of our problems. While we were checking in Dave's coat for his keys, who should we run into but Dave and Ashley? And they didn't look happy. "Where the hell do you think you're going?" Dave growled, holding a .22 revolver mere inches from my forehead. Ashley yanked the pickaxe from Emily's grasp and tossed it aside. They ordered us to sit in the middle of the floor while they zip-tied our hands behind our backs. So much for escaping, I thought. Inwardly, I prayed that Emily hid the taser in her bra or something. Dave turned to Ashley, who had slung the sledgehammer over one shoulder. "Go let him in," he ordered. "I'll work on the signal." As Ashley strode away, Emily gave Dave a betrayed look. "Dave, please listen to me. We need to capture Whisper, or better yet, destroy him." The younger man cackled. "Oh, Emily, Emily, Emily. What part of his potential are you missing? This is a huge breakthrough. It could change the world of robotics forever, and you actually suggest we destroy him? He is an AI capable of thinking for himself. You just want to weaponize him," Emily shot back. Her eyes were fire. "He was my idea, my baby. What he's doing isn't what I programmed him to do. Instead of leveraging me and my husband as pawns, help us or let us go." Dave sneered at my wife. I so wanted to punch his nose into his brain, but I wasn't man enough to overpower him that night. Dave stopped typing for a bit to glance back at us. "See, you call him your baby, Em, and yet you want to destroy him. You are just as responsible for what this animatronic does as we are. And now you're pointing the finger at me and Ash? Do you even hear yourself, Emily? I'm talking about potential here. You and your husband would have been rich beyond your wildest dreams if you hadn't decided to screw things up from the get-go." "I didn't care about the money," Emily cried, tears going down her cheeks. "I just wanted Evan to be proud of me. I just wanted to advance my career a little. This was never about—" Dave swung around and delivered a swift slap to her face. "Hey," I bellowed, rising to my feet. "Touch her again and all." Dave raised a gun to my chest. "Or you'll what, Nick?" he mockingly asked. "I don't believe you're in any position to be making threats." That smug bastard's smile was wiped off his face when he felt a shotgun barrel at the base of his neck. "But I am," a gravelly voice boomed. The man I assumed was Evan stood behind Dave. He had snuck in so quietly that neither of us realized he was there until we heard the click of the shotgun. "Dave, what's the meaning of this?" Dave genuinely seemed surprised. "Evan, buddy, what are you doing here?" "Shut up and answer the question," Evan roared, flinging Dave down. "Unless you want to be picking your teeth up with broken fingers, I suggest you explain to me why experiment WH-12934 has escaped containment." Dave let loose a small wheezing sound as he stared longingly at his laptop. Evan continued. "Yes, I know all about your little project, Dave. And while Emily seemed to have the right idea about progress, it appears to me like you and Ashley had different ideas. If we make it out of here alive, Dave, I'm sending you to prison. You've taken things too far this time, terrorizing this innocent couple. Ashley strolled into the room. David, I can't find... Her words died in her throat when she saw Evan standing there. For just a second, she reminded me of a deer caught in a car's headlights, eyes wide and legs stiff. Then she made a run for it. Ashley, Evan yelled. Dave's fight or flight had already kicked in, and now he saw his chance. With Evan distracted, he wrenched a shotgun out of his arms and threw it across the room. As the two men sparred, Emily had gotten to her feet. A large red bruise swelled on the side of her face where Dave had struck her. She turned to me and said, "We need to go, Nick, now." I followed Emily, our hands still bound behind us, to the kitchen. We opened the silverware drawer and rummaged through it, searching for a knife sharp enough to cut the ties. Emily found one and told me to turn around. She worked as fast as she could through my binds as I nervously watched a hallway we just came out of. I told myself I'd barrel into Dave if he came running for us. I was already mad that he hit Emily. I couldn't let him kill my wife. As soon as my hands were free, a shotgun rocked the house. Gunshot rocked the house. Then another. Ears ringing, I quickly turned to free Emily. "Hurry, Nick, hurry," she whimpered in panic. I slashed at the ties and we turned around to run for the front door when Dave appeared, holding the shotgun. "On your knees," he screamed, clutching a large red spot on his shirt. I hit Emily behind me as we dropped to the floor. Still watching us, Dave held up his computer. "If either of you move, I'll blow your brains out, you hear me?" he shouted. I stared into the soul of this madman and knew he wasn't bluffing. With a shaky laugh, Dave began typing on the laptop with one hand and held the gun in the other. "Nick," Emily sobbed, hugging me. I held her and said, "Shh, I'll protect you, sweetie." Then we heard a scream that made all three of us jump. I can say from experience that I've had my unpleasant share of bad dreams and memories, but in the instant that I heard that scream of absolute agony, it somehow made all my nightmares seem insignificant in comparison. Dave typed quicker than he had before. "Come on, work, you stupid piece of..." A beep was heard from the laptop. "Yes," Dave grinned, and then typed for a few more seconds. "That ought to do it. With Evan out of the way, this should be a breeze." Emily gasped. "You don't mean..." She trailed off, unable to willingly complete her sentence. Dave smirked, flashing a wink at her. "Oh, I mean, baby." The back door was heard being smashed to pieces, its glass shards flying across the table and floor. It sounds distinctly like wind chimes, I thought, yet I trembled. As much as I tried to calm my mind and focus on getting out of there, it felt like my bones turned to slush. For the next minute or so, all was silent. There were no sounds other than Dave's computer whirring, Emily's scared breathing, and the storm outside coming inside, the wind fluttering across the curtains in the living room. The silence was broken by Ashley's voice, coming from the direction of the dining area. "David, help me!" she screamed. Dave was on his feet, pushing us toward the sound of his gun. Emily was hugging me so tight I could barely breathe. I didn't care. I needed to be ready for whatever I saw, for her sake as well as my own. But I couldn't have prepared to save my life. Ducking under the archway of our door in order to get in, I had my first real sight of Whisper. His fur was slate gray, although fairly darkened due to being out in the rain. His red eyes glared from within deep sockets, staring at nothing in particular. His claws glistened from the light emanating from Dave's laptop, a stark chrome in color. He was probably the biggest animatronic bear I'd seen in my life, standing about 12 feet in height. Although most of the bears I saw wore things like top hats and bow ties, Whisper wore nothing but the matted fur on his endoskeleton. "Whisper," Dave murmured, approaching the animatronic. "Let's get down to business. I need you to kill these two, then we can discuss your capabilities. Do you understand?" The bear held his gaze fixated on nothing, pupils narrowed to slits. Dave tried again. "Listen, big boy, I didn't spend all night planning and looking for a signal and getting into a shootout, just so you can be picky about your prey. Now where's Ashley, Whisper?" The bear slowly looked down at Dave, who smiled. Then the bear opened its jaws and screeched, "David, help me!" Dave staggered backwards, dropping the shotgun in the process. Every nerve in my body twitched, begging me to grab it, but I couldn't move. I was too horrified about what was going on in front of me. This thing was imitating Ashley's voice. Blood seeped from between Whisper's teeth, spilling down his jaw and onto the front of Dave's shirt. A thin strand of Ashley's hair hung loosely from one of the bear's canines. "Oh my God," Dave said, entranced. "This is incredible. You can actually mimic voices of other..." Dave never said what he was going to say. Kind of hard to, since Whisper snapped his jaws around his throat with a crunch. Dave's eyes went wide and he started gargling in his own blood. Whisper lifted him into the air, wrapping his paws around the man's body. With one downward motion, Dave's neck was torn out, esophagus sticking out like a lollipop. Human gristle drizzling from his maw. Whisper turned his attention to me and Emily. We backed away, not taking our eyes off the monster. "Silly, foolish Emily," he crooned in Dave's voice. He followed us, not in a hurry. It was almost as if the animatronic was relishing in our terror, patiently stalking toward us like he had all the time in the world. Emily's grip on my hand tightened. I had never seen her so scared, not even that one time we thought a tornado was going to touch down in our front yard last summer. Regardless, I was ready to defend her. I knew I stood no chance against this thing, but I wanted to buy her some time to get out of here. We heard a shout from behind us. I turned from the abomination in front of me to see Evan crawling toward us from the hall. "Run, both of you. Get the keys from Dave's satchel. I'll distract Big Boy over there." Evan was armed with the pistol. Somehow I knew it would do him no good, but if we didn't chance making a run for it now, we'd all die and his sacrifice would be for nothing. Whisper roared, obliterating Dave's laptop with one huge foot. Without waiting for Emily's approval, I ran to the guest room and seized the satchel. Half dragging Emily behind me as I ran out the front door, I risked a look back over my shoulder. Twice the pistol went off, then a third time. The bullets bounced off the bear's metal body, as though they were insects. I don't think there was a dent on him. "No, stop," Emily was screaming. "We can't leave him here to die." I didn't have time to argue. I just pushed her into Dave's car and started the ignition. From behind the windshield, I could hardly make out the silhouette of Whisper lifting Evan into the air with one arm, claws poised to kill. Listening to Emily's shrieking protest in the back seat, I made my decision. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, flooring it. The car sailed through the front yard, smashing through the brick house into the living room, and finally rocketed into Whisper. The animatronic's body caved in the hood of the car, and he went flying over our heads. Evan was catapulted out of his death grip, landing near the wall with a thud. I jumped out of the driver's seat, grabbing Evan under his arms, and practically threw him into the passenger seat. As soon as I closed the door, Whisper stood up and glared at me, licking his bloody chops. Emily screamed, holding her face. Whisper howled in rage, body slamming the tailgate with such force that every window in the car shattered to dust. I dashed into the driver's seat and threw the car into reverse. It struck Whisper again, only this time he went under the vehicle. Loud, frantic, metallic scratching filled the air, and nothing. Without waiting to see if the bear would rise again, I peeled out of the house and left our property. It has been about 2 weeks since the events of that night. Me and Emily never returned to our home again, even after Evan called the cops and got them to check the place out. Dave and Ashley's bodies were gone without trace. Whisper vanished into the night. I suspect he's still out there somewhere, still a mindless and murderous machine. Thus far, nobody has believed my story. But to those who would listen, I only ask you to remember one thing. The only way to escape a character is through pure and simple luck. After my harrowing adventure, I think that's the only explanation as to why I survived. And even then, just by the skin of my teeth.